we've got an obesity epidemic, we've got a diabetes epidemic. There's definitely some education awareness around, added sugars at this point. Many people know that you probably shouldn't have too many added sugars to, at least. And so some people at least are being more mindful of that. This has given rise to things like non-caloric artificial sweeteners, right? That don't have the calorie content, but do give you the tasty component that we enjoy. Is there anything interesting going on there in terms of the vagus nerve or the reinforcing effects and the rewarding effects that these sweet things have? Things like stevia, things like other artificial sweeteners that don't have the calorie content of glucose, but still taste sweet.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and actually it's really interesting because these non-nutritive sweeteners tend to not activate the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is basically blind to these things. So it really activates the taste receptors on the tongue. It tastes sweet, but then when it gets to the gut, it's basically a wash. It doesn't do anything, and it doesn't cause the dopamine release either as a consequence of not activating the vagus nerve. And so if you kind of follow through with that logic, what is happening every time we taste a non-nutritive sweetener is we're now disconnecting the sweetness with calorie. And so it's actually messing up our prediction, our ability to make these predictions. So now next time when you eat something that is sweet and has calories, you're no longer as good at predicting how many calories are in that thing based on the sweetness. And actually that has really nasty consequences because it means you're going to eat, in probability, you're going to eat more of it because you just don't know that there's this many calories just based on the sweetness.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask is, okay, so the idea is if I'm eating a non-nutritive sweetener, it doesn't have caloric value. The vagus nerve is not detecting it and tapping into the dopamine reward system in the brain. It's actually causing my brain to sort of miscalibrate the association between how much calorie is in the caloric sweetener or the sugary substance. And so I might actually eat more of it later because the prediction is no longer as strong as to what its caloric content will be.
Yeah, I mean, that's the logic. That probably needs to be tested in a lab setting, but that's kind of the thought process. Yeah, I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it makes logical sense. Okay, so it hasn't been directly tested.
I don't think so. So there are some cool studies that are done in humans that show that there's a ideal level. So if your sweetness matches the calories, you're more likely to prefer that. And so I don't even know if this is published, but I've seen the data where people have tested Coke versus Pepsi. So Coke actually hits that sweet spot where it's just the right amount of sweetness for the number of calories, and Pepsi's is slightly off. And so actually when people do the Coke Pepsi challenge, people tend to prefer Coke. And we think that might be in part the reason for that. But actually, if you artificially in the lab decouple the sweetness from the amount of calories that and these are humans, are receiving, they're really good at figuring out which one is the right one. And if you disconnect that, there's evidence that it might actually cause metabolic effects in the long run. So I think there is evidence to support what I said earlier. It's not just a wild speculation at this point.
Yeah.
But the actual direct evidence that if you chronically consume these non-nutritive sweeteners, that it'll make you overconsume the sugars. I think that's probably the bit where we need a little bit more evidence for.
Yeah. I mean, it should be readily testable in rodents.
Absolutely testable. Absolutely.
Interesting. But that makes sense. Okay, so the non-nutritive sweeteners, when you first started saying like, oh, they don't activate the reward circuitry in the same way, naively you go, oh, that's good. But unless you're going to completely give up caloric sugars, which is effectively impossible, it could actually break your brain's ability to accurately assess to tie the reward component to the calorie component.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. What can you just, I actually don't know beyond like stevia and maybe one more, what are the major non-caloric sweeteners that are out there and how do they actually work?
Well, so that's not my area of expertise, so I don't want to kind of go too much into this, but they all activate the same receptors in the tongue that the T1R3 receptors that are give you the ability to taste sweetness. That's pretty much,
Okay.
which is the same thing that the sugar that caloric sugars do. So they activate the same sweet receptors on the tongue, but whereas glucose is taken up by a specific transporter in the gut, those do not take up the non-nutritive sweeteners.
Got it. Got it. I want to ask you a little bit about gut hormones as well,
Okay.
and how gut brain communication is happening via that route. And there's two that I'm hoping that you can talk about a little bit. Let's start with leptin. So, what is leptin? Where does it come from? And what is it? What's the basic explanation for what it does?
So leptin is a hormone that's released from adipose tissue, so from fat cells.
Mm-hmm.
It's the amount that is released is proportional to the amount of fat that you have. So the more fat you have, the more leptin you have. And it's thought to be kind of a long-term sensor of energy status. So it kind of doesn't necessarily fluctuate very much from meal to meal, but it does fluctuate as your body weight changes. And it's an important signal to kind of maintain your kind of body weight over a long period of time. So that's kind of mostly what leptin does, but there's also a pool of leptin that's released from the GI tract. And so that accounts for about 25% of the total leptin that's circulating at any time in your body. And that does fluctuate in response to a meal. So after a meal, you get more leptin release. And so actually, while leptin generally is thought to control your body weight, there is kind of an acute response in response to a meal that does control how much you eat. And it's possible that it works through different mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. And this is meant to signal satiety.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So in both cases, it controls how much you eat. Yeah, it's just satiety.
So more leptin means you would then eat less.
So that's mostly true. There's this weird kind of dichotomy that happens in obesity, where, of course, I said the more fat you have, the more leptin you have. And so actually it's kind of this reverse effect where actually in obesity, although you have more leptin, you're less responsive to that leptin. So the ability of the cells to respond to the higher levels of leptin is impaired. And so in that sense, it's called leptin resistance. When you have leptin resistance, although you have more leptin, you're kind of insensitive to the effects of leptin. But yeah, in general, leptin equals satiety, in the exception being obesity.
So leptin resistance, your cells are no longer responding to leptin in the way that they're supposed to. Is there an analogy there with insulin resistance? Is it the same kind of phenomenon?
Yeah, I think it actually works in quite similar. The underlying there's lots of different ways that this is thought to happen. There's at the molecular level, the way that this happens are going to be slightly different, but overall, it's very similar. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And can we think about these things, these metabolic issues, leptin resistance, insulin resistance? Are they like a drug addiction where it's like you've taken so much of a drug that your cells are no longer responding to it because they've either downregulated the receptors or the receptors have become insensitive or something? But is it, in essence, it's a response to too much of something? Yes.
Yeah, I think that's that's the way I understand it. So when leptin activates the receptor, there's this negative feedback loop that happens. And that's kind of traditional in most of physiology, right? You get feedback loops. And so what that means is that as there's more leptin and there's more signaling, then it also has some sort of inhibitor that's kind of built into the system so that it feeds back onto the receptor and essentially shuts it off. And so even though you've still got leptin present, then it doesn't really signal anymore. So what's thought to happen with leptin resistance is that feedback mechanism is kind of hyperactivated. And so you're kind of turning off the ability of the receptor to respond to something, even though you're not even responding to it in the first place.
I see. So if you've got a normal lean individual who's not leptin resistant, you would expect them to feel more satiated, less hungry when their leptin levels are higher. But if you had a obese person, especially if they'd been obese for a long time, if they were leptin resistant, you would actually see higher levels of leptin in them, even though they are eating more than the lean person.
Yeah, I think that made sense. I and maybe I tuned out a bit, but just to be clear, when there's more leptin in the lean person, you're going to eat less.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
yeah.
But if you're leptin resistant, you could actually have elevated leptin levels that,
but with no effect.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
What about, so there's this other gut hormone that people have been talking about a lot recently because of some of the new drugs that are out there, GLP-1. So what is that?
Yeah, GLP-1's a fascinating drug. It's well, first of all, it's Ozempic and these other drugs that have GLP-1 activate on the GLP-1 receptors, and they're very effective at causing weight loss, reducing food intake, have a lot of these effects. But in the body, we have GLP-1 in two different places. One is in the gut. So there's specialized cells in the gut. They make up about 1% of the total cells in our gut, and they will release GLP-1 in response to the arrival of food in our intestines. So when there's food in the intestine, GLP-1 is released, gets into the circulation. It's not clear if it's working through the vagus nerve or if it goes into the circulation and acts directly on the brain. Mm-hmm. But it essentially causes you to eat less. The one thing about GLP-1 is under normal conditions, your endogenous GLP-1 it's very rapidly degraded. And so it's not, that's why it's not clear if it's actually effective at the level of the brain, but it will definitely activate the vagus nerve. There's lots of GLP-1 receptors on the vagus nerve, and activation of GLP-1 receptor expressing neurons causes significant reduction of food intake. So this pathway gets activated when you eat a meal, triggers these GLP-1 receptor vagal neurons to tell the brain to stop eating. And then there's a separate population of GLP-1 producing cells in the brain. And when they're activated, usually in response to a very large meal, will also tell you to stop eating.
Okay, so this is a mechanism. Food gets into the intestine, GLP-1 is released, and it's causing you to eat less. So it's a way for the body to tell itself, hey, we've got food in the intestine. We don't need to eat as much in the near future.
Yeah, definitely at the level of the gut. And then at the level of the brain, it seems like that happens in very large meals. So when you're at that point where you're feeling really, really full and maybe a little bit uncomfortable, that's when your GLP-1 in the brain is telling you, okay, you really need to stop eating now.
And so you said leptin gets released from fat cells. Did you say where GLP-1 gets released? What kind of cells?
Yeah, so it's cells either in the gut, these specialized cells in the gut, or this very unique population of cells in the brain.
In the brain. And then you said this other feature it has, it's very rapidly degraded. That's a feature that various other signaling molecules have, and it's often a very important component of their temporal regulation. You only want the signal to be there for a certain amount of time. It sounds like the new drugs, like Ozempic, they are like GLP-1 in that they activate the GLP-1 receptor to drive less eating, but they are unlike it in the sense that they aren't as rapidly degraded. Why were they made that way, if you know, and do you think that we should be paying attention to that?
So that's a feature rather than a bug. I mean, that was the underlying reason for making these drugs, was to make them like GLP-1 but longer lasting. The idea was that GLP-1 is really effective at causing you to reduce your food intake, but it's so short-lived that if you give that in the body, if you give that to somebody, it just wouldn't have a long enough effect. And so they extended the half-life of GLP-1 in the circulation. And with the latest version, the semaglutide, Ozempic, you only need to take it once a week. So it's really prolonging the half-life of the GLP-1.
Do you think that could pose a risk of these people developing GLP-1 resistance?
Yeah, so that's interesting because it doesn't look like that's what's happening. So like I said, usually in physiology, what you see is that there's these feedback loops and they turn themselves off. But it seems like maybe because the body has developed a system by which you don't need a feedback loop because it gets degraded quickly, maybe I don't know if this is true, but maybe this is why there doesn't seem to be a feedback loop. And so it allows for these longer lasting drugs to continue to have beneficial effects.
And is there any, is clearly very effective at helping people lose weight. We've seen that already. Obviously, they did the trials to show that it enabled it to achieve the success it has commercially. Any potential like downsides or things we should be looking out for in terms of this drug based on what you know about the basic biology here?
Well, I'm not sure based on the biology, but from what I'm hearing, there's a few things that we need to kind of pay attention to that maybe people are not aware of. First of all, it's not effective in everyone. So it's talked about as this miracle drug, and yet that's because you only hear about the people in which it's working. They're the ones that are kind of telling everybody how effective it is on them, and you don't really hear people talking about it when it doesn't work, because they start, probably because they're wondering, well, why isn't it working on me? I don't want to tell everybody that it's not working on me. So you don't really hear about the stories of it not working. There's some concerns about how the weight is lost. So it's very effective in weight loss on a whole, right? So I'm not talking about individuals. Some individuals it works great, some individuals it doesn't work at all. But as a whole, it's very effective. You get around 15 to 20% weight loss. So like massive weight loss. But how that weight is coming off is kind of something that we need to be paying attention to. It doesn't look like it's all coming off in terms of your fat mass. It looks like there's some lean mass, some muscle mass, maybe even bone mass. So, this is just something to pay attention to. I'm not saying that we know for sure that this is a problem, but it's something that we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah.
And then the kind of other thing that
actually, I'm sorry. Can you actually unpack that a little bit more? Why would we want to pay attention to it if you're losing muscle and or bone mass in addition to fat mass? Why is that an issue?
Yeah, I mean, then you're affecting your kind of so if we're using it to treat obesity, what we want to do is get rid of the excess body weight. We don't want to get rid of our what makes us basically the part of our body that is burning off energy. We don't want to be affecting that. We want to, ideally what we'd want is a drug that just causes the fat to melt off without impacting anything else. And so here the concern is that it's impacting more than just the fat. And if it causes you problems to gain muscle mass or to regain kind of your normal body tone, essentially, that could be problematic. Now, I'm not saying that is what is happening. I'm saying that this is just something that we need to be paying attention to, because from what I'm seeing, it's not 100% fat mass loss. And then the other thing that I think that we need to be paying attention to with these drugs is that it seems to be impacting the reward system, which can be both good and bad, right? So yeah. It would be great, actually, if we could, as we talked about earlier, inhibit those fat and sugar reward systems so that when we eat them, we're not so motivated to go eat them again. But the problem here is that it seems to be globally reducing reward as a whole. So there's just a loss of hedonics. And in some cases, it's great. I've heard of people who were addicted to gambling, for example, for a very long time. They started going on these drugs, and now they're no longer gambling anymore. So, I mean, so like these remarkable stories. Now, these are somewhat anecdotal. I don't want to make too much of a big deal out of this, but it does point to this idea that maybe it's kind of globally reducing our reward circuits. And the problem with that is if we don't have any reward, if nothing is rewarding and nothing is pleasurable anymore, then maybe it's not a great way to live.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you remember the drug rimonabant?
Right. Yes. So that's a CB1 receptor antagonist. Yeah.
Yeah, and just for the people that don't know, this was a similar story in essence. It was a weight loss drug. It was effective. It was approved in Europe. It acted through a different mechanism. It was a cannabinoid receptor antagonist. So it's kind of like THC gives you the munchies. It's sort of like the opposite. It's like an anti-THC type of drug, and it worked. The problem is it had this global sort of effect on reward, and people started getting depressed and even committing suicide.
Yeah, so I haven't heard anything about people committing suicide on Ozempic, but that would be the concern, right? That would be why you'd be paying attention to this, making sure that this isn't something that we have to worry about long term. But I think even if it doesn't cause depression, if it just reduces your ability to enjoy the day-to-day life, I mean,
right,
that's maybe a reason that people would no longer want to be on there. So there's that initial benefit of I lose all the weight, And then do I want to continue on this drug when I'm not getting other pleasures? Now you're having to make that choice. And the problem is, as soon as you come off the drug, you regain the weight. So it's something that you're either on pretty much forever, or yeah. So that's kind of the problem that we have right now. If it's a forever drug, you're gonna have to take it every single day, or not every day, every week. And as soon as you come off of it, you're gonna regain it back. So
yeah, I mean, sort of the sort of future I can see emerging is, there's like two populations of people that we're going to see more and more of: those that self-regulate their behavior by shaping and controlling their own habits actively, and those that are basically just on drugs their entire life to mess with the outputs of the habits that they're not controlling.
yeah, although I want to push back on that a little bit. I mean, you're kind of right that there's certainly a drug versus no drug approach, and both are different approaches. The problem with all of this is that this gut to brain circuit that I was talking about that causes this reinforcement that makes you eat more, it's all subconscious. It's not something that you're controlling, right? You have no control over this. How nutrients activate the dopamine, that is below your level of detection. You don't even know.
Yes, but I mean, but if you have all the knowledge that you just gave us, you do have the ability to control what you purchase, at least to some extent.
You absolutely,
people do it.
So there's a component of decision making there, but when you get this reward, it's not a one-off. It's not that in the moment you're eating it and it makes you eat more in the moment. It actually guides your future decision making as well. And
Absolutely.
so next time when you see something that triggers this memory of, oh, I'm going to get calories if I eat this, and it's something that I want and it's pleasurable, then while you can consciously make the decision, okay, I'm not going to eat this. This is not what I want. The problem is when we start getting in situations where in our daily lives where we're stressed, where we don't have that much, we're not paying attention to these types of decisions every minute of the day. And as soon as we turn that off, we're not consciously aware of this anymore, then we suddenly find ourselves reaching for that donut or whatever. And so I agree with you to a certain degree, like we need to be paying attention to these things. But I think we can't undermine the fact that there is a subconscious component to this that's really undermining our ability to consciously make these.
I think what you're saying is the biology here tells us that to some extent, potentially to a very large extent, it is going to be very difficult for a lot of people to will themselves into the behavioral place they want to be, because all of this stuff is happening at the level of things like the vagus nerve, and a lot of it is not subject to direct conscious control. We are to some extent slaves of our environment.
Yeah, exactly. And beyond that, like our environment isn't just these foods that have these mixes of fats and sugars, but our environment is also the constantly being inundated by all these food cues. And by that, I mean, like we see logos of different restaurants, for example. We see packaging. When we go to the supermarket, even they put certain foods in certain places so that we're more likely to go grab them, right? So all of this is part of our food environment. And all of this triggers us to go and pick these up, to consume these at a subconscious level. And so that's where it's so difficult. That's where this is just basically our whole environment is working against us to making the right decisions.
Mm-hmm.